My name is Bryan Chapell. I am president of Covenant Theological Seminary, and I have been asked by the Cooperative Ministries Committee, which is the meeting of the coordinators of the committees and agencies of the PCA, the chairman of the boards of those committees and agencies, as well as the past 6 moderators of the General Assembly, to speak to you about a proposed strategic plan for the PCA. Now, we're doing this by video so that lots of people can have an awareness of it. We're going through a highlighted plan. If you don't have that in front of you as you're viewing this, I would encourage you to go to the PCA website and look to the administrative committee and go particularly to the stated clerk's work and look for this strategic plan in its highlighted form that will be on that website. Before we consider why we would be looking at a strategic plan, it might be good just to take a snapshot of the PCA and consider where we are, not just as a whole denomination, but even where individual churches are. And for that, I'm going to look at a graph here on the board. If you looked at the PCA as a whole, but then began to consider individual churches and even individual pastors and ruling elders, you would recognize that there are some of us who we might identify as hungry progressives. They are people who are involved in outreach and cultural transformation, who very much view that as the push of where the PCA ought to be going. And if you kind of hang with these fellows a lot, what narrative you'll hear, the story that's often told, is that their sense is the PCA is too narrow, that it's inward, perhaps backward, perhaps regional or parochial, and therefore not making the progress that it ought to make. We would say, however, there's another large, faithful contingent of the PCA that we might identify as the hold-fast conservatives. Often, if you hang with these folks over here, the narrative that's told is that the PCA is becoming too broad, that it's lax in its standards, that it's becoming liberal, that it's not holding fast to the values and commitments of the church as a whole. Now, that's almost our polar ends. What's it like in the middle, the vast middle of the PCA? I would say if you're there talking to ruling and teaching elders, you will find that most folks there are proud to be PCA. They're proud to be PCA because, among other things, they love our commitments. In particular, they love our commitments to Scripture and to our confession. And believing that these things are held fast in our culture is beautiful and vital, and most of the PCA loves the fact that we're a denomination that is true to the Scriptures and the Reformed faith. At the same time, while we recognize in local churches where there is love of our commitments, virtually every pastor and session is feeling strangled by secularism. And that strangling evidences itself in losses that we are experiencing as a whole. Now, people experience this in their individual churches, but they feel it's just us. But what they're actually experiencing is a loss of piety. Leaders in the church say, our people are not different than people in the rest of society. In marriage choices, in decision-making, in financial decisions, people are no different, it seems, in the church, or slightly different, than the rest of the culture. But there isn't just a loss of piety. We recognize a dramatic loss of our young. In their high school years, in their college years, young people are leaving our church, as they are, by the way, much of evangelicalism. Young people leave. They typically leave in their late teens or early 20s. Don't return to the church until they begin to have children, but they never return in equal numbers to how many have left. But there's a surprising loss as well, and it is the loss of the mature. The loss of the mature basically is for 2 reasons. We see people who've been the backbone of our churches, people in their 40s and 50s, who are leaving the church for one of 2 reasons: because of style differences. They're not so much differing regarding our position on Scripture and confession, but they, for one reason or another, are concerned over 2 style issues: the style of the minister or the style of the music. Those are usually the compelling issues. So stylistic reasons lead people to change. Another thing that's happening, we are seeing a great breakdown in the marriages of the mature. People who have been in our churches for decades, often the leadership of our church, we are seeing somehow a great erosion of marriage in the church, and when that happens, we see the loss of the mature as well. Because of these losses, there are certain results in our churches. One is there's a great deal of tension. Now you think it's just your church, but many churches are feeling this. That because of these stylistic differences, because of the loss the church is feeling, there seems to be much tension, but it's without a response that's biblical. People are reacting again simply out of emotion, often without the values or the biblical approach to handling problems. There's great tension in the church. And the result of that tension is, among the leaders, the teaching elders and the ruling elders, there is now a great longing. And the great longing is for a purpose that is biblical. We want to believe that we are part of a calling, that we have a passion for the things of God, and that what we see the Spirit doing in the world, we are a part of. We don't like the sense that loss characterizes us. We want to be faithful, not compensate for the loss by being unfaithful or just pragmatic. How do we have a way of being true to our commitments that is dealing with the realities of the cultural pressures and the ecclesiastical pressures that we are feeling as a church, and as a whole recognize we're feeling this? It's not just one or two of you. This is something that's pervasive in the PCA. It's pervasive in evangelicalism in North American culture. And we need to face that and deal with it in a healthy way so that we're united in our calling and have a passion for the purpose of Christ. Let's look at the plan itself. If you think of the reasons for this plan, I want you just to consider, before we get into all the details, this particular important matter. This has been unanimously approved by the coordinators, the chairmen of the boards, and the past 6 moderates. That's a phenomenal achievement in itself, because we run the spectrum of the PCA. But unanimously, we have come together to approve this document. We have a plan because, just to look at the beginning, the Presbyterian Church in America is progressing into its 4th decade with increasing awareness of its challenges. I've mentioned some of those challenges already, but they are sweeping across us. We are accustomed to being a church that says we're one of the fastest growing denominations in North America, but our rate of growth has slowed. And in fact, in this last year, for the first time in our history, we shrank as a denomination in numbers. Now, numbers aren't everything. We know that. But we know the purposes of God are that ultimately the name of Christ, the knowledge of the Lord, shall cover the earth as waters cover the sea. And shrinking as a church isn't the best part of playing out that plan for the cause of Christ. The goal is not to become the new Amish. That can't be what our strategic plan is. We have to be thinking, how do we participate in what God is doing in the world?